Hello, my name's Eric Johnson, and I think I'm supposed to be out of the way of that. But I'm very excited to talk with you about a project that I've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years with a few theologians, and but it's still in its infancy. So I'm really happy that you're here. There's nothing, very little that's out there in the internet or in print about this particular project. So I'm just happy you decided to show up and see what happens. Let me begin with some of my background, and then what I'd like us to do is to introduce ourselves and share a little bit about your interest in what this topic will be about. My first educational experience in higher education after I became a Christian was I went to Toronto Baptist Seminary, which is kind of like a Bible college seminary, so I could go and get a bachelor's degree in theology. And I thought I was training for the ministry, but I ended up getting into social work and worked in social work for 6 years, and along the way began to realize that the Christian work in social work was not very theological. There were a lot of Christians who were drawn to the field of helping people in the public square or public mental health, but there wasn't so much robust theological work being done that was helping people to think about helping people in say prison ministry, drug abuse treatment that was distinctly Christian. And so I decided it would be helpful for me to get some more education, and I went to Calvin College and got at the time they had a program called Master of Arts in Christian Studies, and you could focus in a number of different areas, and I took behavioral sciences. And so I studied with a few psychologists, and George Marsden was the head of the program at that time, and did a little bit of work in theology and philosophy as well while I was there. And I think I would call that a worldview degree. It was really helpful to prepare me for my next big jump into the secular academia. And I went to Michigan State University and got a PhD in educational psychology, thinking that I was going to spend the rest of my life teaching psychology at a Christian school, Christian university. And I ended up going to Northwestern College. It's now called University of Northwestern, I think. And for 10 years, I was there. And I went to the program because the program at that time said it was an integration program, and they wanted to integrate faith into psychology. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. So I was there trying to do that. But as I got into the program and got to know my colleagues and began to realize what they were doing, and they began realizing what I was doing, we actually started to be at odds with one another. Things got so bad that my colleagues kicked me out of the psychology department. Thankfully the school wanted to keep me, and so they found a place for me in the Bible department. And one of the reasons was because I would teach some Bible in my psychology classes. And I thought that was integration, right? That's integration. But my colleagues would tell me that, no, you're not supposed to do that. That's for the Bible department. The Bible department teaches the Bible. We teach psychology. And I honestly, when I look back, I wasn't innocent of all wrongdoing. I was young, I was arrogant, somewhat, and so I think I challenged my colleagues to be more biblical, to be more Christian in their scholarship, and in the process I offended them. And so they were happy to kick me out of the department. And thankfully I had some friends in the Bible department, and they didn't mind having me. So I taught Bible classes for about 3 years there. And we got a new president, and he heard the story, and he said, Eric Johnson belongs in the psychology department, so he put me back in. And, you know, I have to tell you, those were some of the hardest years of my professional life. Because I knew they didn't want me there. They knew that I didn't belong, and we had some department meetings that were very unpleasant for all of us, I'm sure. So I found a position opened up at Southern Baptist Seminary, and I was in America. There's an organization called the Coalition of Christian Colleges and Universities, and I had been to a number of their programs, and so I was aware that what I experienced at Northwestern College was not unusual. At least, I mean, it was pretty unusual that I got kicked out and all that. That's mostly on me. But the fact that the psychology department did not want biblical teaching in the department, even though they said they did integration and they had a capstone course called the Integration of Psychology and Theology, they really didn't want a strong theological theme, strong theological teaching in their department, and that's pretty universal at Christian colleges and universities in America. And I love Christian colleges and universities, and I believe in Christian higher education. So I don't mean to be throwing rocks at anybody. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why this has happened. But I began to think that maybe the best place for a guy like me is at a seminary. And so I found that there was an opening at Southern Baptist Seminary in the counseling department. They called themselves an integration program, but my colleagues said that they really wanted more theology in their department. The administration said, we really would like you to come and help the department become more biblical. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe this is really, in America, maybe seminaries are the best place to do this kind of work, disciplinary work that's informed by Scripture and good theology. So I've been there since 2000, and I love my school, and it's been a great journey. But I also have to add that around 2005, the vice president of academic affairs at that time, Russell Moore, decided that he didn't think integration went far enough, and he didn't feel that our department was where he wanted it to. And so he turned our department into a biblical counseling department, which honestly I think does make good sense at a seminary to have biblical counseling, because pastors are responsible to minister the Word of God, and biblical counseling is the kind of counseling pastors do and ought to do and always have done. So I understood that, but now I found myself on the outs in a certain way, because I'm really a psychologist. And when I came to the seminary, I said, I don't really belong in a seminary. I should be in a Christian university, but I can't find a Christian university that'll have me. So can I teach here? And yeah, we would like you to teach here. But now in 2005, I was told by the powers that be, really at that time the chair of my department, that I probably needed to look for another job. And I actually went to Union University. I don't know if I told you this, Bradley, but yeah. And I was in dialogue with David Dockery, the president of Bradley's, former president of your school, and we were talking about starting a master's program in Christian counseling that would allow Scripture to deeply inform it. And then a tornado happened. And so we kind of put the kibosh on that for a while. A book of mine came out called Foundations for Soul Care that was very theological. Russell Moore read that, and he came back to me and he said, Eric, we'd like you to stay, actually. We think that you are theological enough to stay here at Southern Seminary. And at that point, I kind of thought, yeah, this is probably good. I will stay, and I've been there ever since. But I'm a psychologist who teaches in a biblical counseling program now. So, anyway, a little bit of my story, which just wonderfully illustrates, I think, the challenges of Christian scholarship in our day. So, let me think what else. So about, I can't remember how this happened. I met a fellow named Bruce Ashford somehow. I think I taught at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary some courses, and I met Bruce Ashford, who was the provost there at Southeastern. And he talked to me about a friend of his called Craig Bartholomew, who is a really important, in my opinion, one of the younger than me biblical scholars of our day, who's written a number of books in various interesting areas that are interdisciplinary. I think would be the standard word, and yet he's a biblical scholar. And so I think I'm going to mention his name because he's done so much important work, and because he's a colleague of mine on this project, Craig Bartholomew. And he's Bartholomew. And he has, that's a W, sorry, I ran out of room. Bartholomew. And he has written some wonderful books in biblical scholarship, edited them. And he and I began talking about this project, about the need for developing a model of Christian scholarship that allows the Bible to be foundational to the work. And we had three, and I should also add, along the way I became friends with a Seventh-day Adventist millionaire, donor, who wanted to fund this project because he so believes in the role of the Bible in Christian scholarship. And so we had 3 meetings where we gathered Christian scholars together to talk about this project and where we might take it. And finally, this past year, we held a public conference at Houston Baptist University. We had some wonderful people there. Some of whom you may know. Kevin Van Hooser was there, Stephen Evans, great Christian philosopher, Peter Leithart, real thoughtful Christian scholar, Leland Ryken, who's an English literature professor, writer at Wheaton. He's now retired, but he's incredible. And a number of others that were there, where we began to explore what this project might look like. And at this point, I'm sitting on a set of papers, and I'm supposed to write a proposal to a book publisher to put them together so that we can get a book out that is, trying to articulate at least the first public attempt in writing to articulate this project. So you can see how young this is in terms of what we're doing currently. In another sense, it goes back to the Bible itself. In Christ are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And the scriptures are a set of texts that cast a vision. Calvin says that the Bible are to be our spectacles through which we view the world. And to think about that, one could write a whole book on the Bible as our spectacles, I think. But to take that seriously is to see a way of Christian scholarship that we see illustrated in the great Christian, thoughtful leaders of Christian history. Augustine is everybody's favorite, because he did this work so superlatively and really got the ball rolling more than anybody else, although there were others that are worth paying attention to. But Augustine's probably one of the greatest. Honestly, I used to be skeptical of Thomas Aquinas, but now I think of him as one of the great leaders in doing good Christian scholarship. I know Protestants differ on that, but I've read enough Christian philosophers who have said we need to rethink Thomas Aquinas. He wasn't perfect, but he was better than we thought he was. And just a short little explanation of that. That was because the followers of Thomas Aquinas around the Reformation era had by that time had a distorted understanding of Thomas Aquinas. Bellarmine, Suarez, and others who tried to do a kind of model of Thomism that was actually differed significantly from Thomas and was probably, according to John Milbank, more influenced by Duns Scotus, who kind of took things in a wrong direction, away from a more biblically holistic model. So part of my work in the last few years has been to read at least a little bit of Thomas Aquinas. But I'm really reformational. John Calvin, Jonathan Edwards, and especially Abraham Kuyper, we'll talk about a couple of these guys a little bit later, have had a big impact on me. And so really this model I don't think is radically new. It's in one sense an ancient classic model of Christian scholarship, but that in the modern era was lost. And I'm afraid that much Christian scholarship of the last 100 years, certainly evangelical scholarship of the last 50, 60 years, has been affected by modernism a lot. And in some sense, this radical Christian scholarship model is a call back to the Middle Ages, in a way. I hope that's not too scary or too disappointing, but I consider the Middle Ages, in some respects, to be a high mark of Christian scholarship, with Bonaventure, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas, and Julian of Norwich in another genre. But what we have to do is we have to put it into the 21st century. And one way of talking about this, I have a friend, P.J. Watson, a psychologist who's very thoughtful about these matters, and he calls himself a postmodern Christian scholar. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but I like it. Postmodern. So there are things to benefit. Fundamentally, I'm a pre-modern. But there are things to learn from modernity. It's not all bad. We don't want to throw everything out, but we can't live by its lights fundamentally. And unfortunately, I think many Christian scholars have become too modernist without knowing it. And then, of course, there's postmodernism, and there are things there that we can learn from. It's not all bad. It's not all good. We certainly can't follow radical secular postmodernism in all respects, but there are things we can learn from it. So this idea of a postmodern Christian scholar is to learn from all of this, but then to do deeply Christian scholarship in the 21st century. Now, postmodern is too complicated, and so I don't tend to use it much. The term that I like it most is radical Christian scholarship. Radical, to the root. I don't know how much I'm going to repeat of this when I get into my PowerPoint. I can't remember how much I've written on the PowerPoint about this, but radical Christian scholarship. What's the biggest problem with this title, do you suppose? There's probably a couple.
Sounds aggressive.
Oh, wow. Man, thank you for that. I've had Christian friends say, I just don't like it. I don't know why, but I just don't like it. But I think that may be a part of it. And I don't know. I don't mean to be in any way pejorative. I think women have a lot to contribute to Christian scholarship, but I wonder if it's a woman that would feel that it's aggressive, but whereas a guy's not going to pick it up quite that way. So I welcome that feedback. So that's a liability. It's going to come across to some certainly then I think as aggressive. What else?
I mean, it potentially has been used to cover a lot of different, quite extreme positions, and some people might think it means being extreme.
Yes.
I think the root back to the roots, I think is
it's a good word.
But I don't know how it sounds to us.
Yes. Thank you. So let's think about what our friend here just said. So there's the radical Reformation. Is it radical like Anabaptists and Mennonites? You're from Britain, And there's a radical orthodoxy that is out there, headed by John Milbank. I can't remember all the folks. That's it. Yes, those are the big three, the trinity of radical orthodoxy. And I am inspired by their work, but I don't agree with them in every respect, and they're a little too Anglo-Catholic for me, and so it also could come across as, is this just radical orthodoxy for Christian scholars? So I think you're right. What does radical mean? To the root, though. So I continue using it at some risk. But another term, which has its own liabilities, is transdisciplinary. Transdisciplinary. And so and by the way, there's a website. If you Google the transdisciplinary group, you will see we have a website. I think probably the website was mostly just devoted to our conference that we held in February, and we haven't done much with it since. So it's not very valuable at the moment, but we're hoping to beef it up. But this is the term that we also use to distinguish this particular model. So I think before we go around the room and talk, I think what I'd like to do is explain that. There are two other terms that could be used that are similar, at least in their root, and that would be cross-disciplinary, and one I've already used, interdisciplinary scholarship. Each of them has a slightly different meaning, and when you can actually read books on each of these topics, it's quite interesting. And they do distinguish folks who really wade into this kind of scholarship, both secularists as well as Christians. They would make a distinction, and I want to make a distinction. Cross-disciplinary scholarship, I kind of see is like disciplines maybe flying over other disciplines and dropping leaflets. I also think transdisciplinary scholarship is a nice ideal, but what it ends up meaning usually at say Christian colleges and a lot of schools is you get a transdiscipline. I'm sorry, did I say trans? I'm sorry, I meant interdisciplinary. So interdisciplinary usually means at schools is you take three majors, in a program of study. You could take sociology, business, and communications classes, and in any order or whatever, and then that's called interdisciplinary a degree. So you can get a BA in interdisciplinary studies. And that's great. I have no problem with that. I think the more we interact in these disciplines, the better. But transdisciplinary is more radical. It's suggesting by anybody who's using the term, secularists as well as us, it's suggesting that it needs to change the disciplines themselves. That it shouldn't leave the disciplines as they are. And so a Christian transdisciplinary model is going to say that there are certain disciplines that are special, that have a special role to play in Christian scholarship that need to permeate all the disciplines. And I'm going to explain that more in a minute, in a few minutes. But I just kind of want to let you know where we're heading today, and you can probably begin piecing together where I'm going to head, given my story. That transdisciplinary scholarship means that some disciplines are going to have a preeminent role to play in the development of all Christian scholarship, according to this model. Conformity to Christ is another way of putting our developmental calling. And so to be more like the resurrected Christ is our goal. What does that mean? To think more like Christ? To have a heart more like Christ with his emotions and desires more and more fully, to evaluate and assess things more and more like Christ, and then to act more like Christ in our lives, to express Christ's character with others based on our calling and so on. So, how does all of that happen? Through union with Christ's death and resurrection. All believers have been joined mystically, according to Calvin. He uses that word, mystical union. We have been joined mystically to Christ's death and resurrection. And now we participate in that union and realize that union temporally through worship and prayer, through listening and reading, through reflection and writing. And a theme that is especially important to me, dialogue with others. Things can happen in this room that never happened before in the history of the world. If you think about it. We can come up with somebody talking, can stimulate an idea, and we might come up with an idea we've never had before that has never been thought exactly the way that it was based on our stories, our histories, our training, that we come up with some new thought. It's not new to God because he's omniscient, but it's new to human history. And that seems to happen through dialogue. Reading is a kind of dialogue, but in the moment of what can happen in a classroom, in a conversation, things happen that cannot be predicted. And there's a beauty. I've been impacted on this topic by a fellow named Mikhail Bakhtin. Some of you Europeans may be familiar with him. Some may be Americans too. But Mikhail Bakhtin has written a lot about dialogue, and I've read a lot about him that has really turned me on, excited me. Because I think God, a nice way to think about it, Kevin Van Hooser develops this, God is in a dialogue with us through the Word of God, Jesus Christ. So I want you to know, this is the set of assumptions that I'm operating out of. I think in Christian scholarship we have to talk about union with Christ in every discipline, even if it's mathematics, at least a little bit, because the Christian life cannot be properly understood apart from our union with Christ. And one or two of you mentioned biblical theology, and I've also been deeply shaped by a biblical theological approach to the history of the human race, and that's informed by my emphasis on resurrection and focus on Christ. So a lot of work could be done, I think, on how the story of Christ is what does Paul call it? The fullness of times, and that in some way it's the center narrative that makes sense of all other narratives, of all of human life. And his life, his death, his resurrection, and his exaltation now I see as the center, the linchpin of reality. And I think that's at least one way. I won't develop that much today, but that's one way in which we can, as Christian scholars, revision all the disciplines. I'll leave it to the mathematicians to figure out how to do that in math. I think it's going to be harder there. But I know in psychology it makes a lot of sense, especially counseling, to talk about Christ's death and resurrection is my bread and butter. I talk about it a lot. But it took me a long time to get here. And I can't do it in mathematics because I'm not an expert in mathematics. So anyway. We got to talk about late modernism and our predicament today. And I'm going to call this theme the twisted genius of late modernism. I originally wrote the perverse genius, but I thought that was too aggressive. But the twisted genius of late modernism, because boy, in my opinion, Satan is a mastermind. He's not as smart as God, thank God, he's finite, but boy, he's smart. And I think what he managed to pull together in late modernism is a masterful accomplishment. Because it looks so smart, and it is so smart in so many ways, but it was so skillfully was able to get Christ and even God out of academia, and it's a fait accompli in our day. So, why do I say it's there's a twisted genius in late modernism? And by the way, when I say late modernism, I only mean I'm distinguishing it from early modernism, which has many problems. Descartes and Locke had many problems, and they sowed some very terrible seeds into Western thought, but at least they allowed for God's presence, and they had some Christian values. So I think thinkers smarter than me have talked about early modernism as having a theistic sensibility that was lost in late modernism. So late modernism is largely atheistic. Though again, we can qualify everything to death. So in late modernism, posing as if it were unbiased and objective and based solely in rationality and empirical investigation. That's its twisted genius, is that it's posed, that's not a very well written sentence, but it poses as if it's unbiased and objective. And it's only based in reason and empirical science, just the facts, just truth. But basing its rationality and science on a naturalistic worldview, set of assumptions that nobody talks about, most people don't, most scientists don't talk about, most thinkers assume them because that's the nature of a worldview. Therefore, it excludes reference to the supernatural in the academic discourse because it's unscientific. And this is such a deep set of assumptions. In all of our education assumed it. If we went to public education, public universities, it's such a done deal. At Michigan State, I became friends with some secular professors, and they wanted to help me out. I would write about God in some of my papers. I was a Van Tillian, by the way, so we need another day to talk together because I think there'd be a lot of fun. But so I would write about God in some of my papers, and I would have one of my colleagues come alongside of me and say, Eric, it's just unprofessional for you to talk about God in your papers. I just want to help you out so that you can be a better scholar. And, I feel that pressure, and my graduation to some degree hinges on pleasing them. And so it's just, and that was 30 years ago. Things have actually improved some since then, I think. I think modernism has bottomed out, at least from my standpoint, in the field of psychology. It's complicated. It's not a whole lot better, but it's at least a little bit better than when I went to grad school. But this has made it very hard for us in academia. And so the result has been the marginalization of distinctly religious perspectives. And again, I say distinctly religious, right? Because in recent postmodern times, it's okay to be religious, especially if it's Buddhist, by the way, at least in my area. But not too distinctly religious. Certainly not Christian. That's the worst thing possible. And then, even being Jewish or Muslim, Hindu, these are too particular, and therefore they're offensive in their own way. Now, someday I think that may improve even in mainstream scholarship. I see some evidence of that in my field. By the way, you would all be interested in a book that I participated in that's being published this coming year. Let me see if I can find the title, because you might seriously be interested in this. I don't know if I have the title. Oh dear. Yeah, I can't find the title. But it's written by a number of Christian scholars in public universities. And I think it has the title something like Christian and Secular Border Crossings. And they play with that metaphor of being in different countries and crossing the border and so on. But these are Christian scholars who are writing about how they have been persecuted in academia for their faith. Here's the thing. It's being published by a mainstream press. And to our knowledge, it may be the first example, maybe I'm naive and I don't know, but one of the first examples of a mainstream press, who I think it was Peter Lang, European press. Yeah, and it's interesting because this is so funny and so ironic because it was published by an editor who works in critical thought, which is typically Marxist, right? Critical thought, criticizing the economic assumptions of naive capitalists, from a Marxist standpoint. But things have moved so far in a good way, in a complicated way, that they're actually willing to say, now the only persecuted minority, and this is one of the themes of the book, the only persecuted minority nowadays is Christianity, or Christians. So you might find that book to be inspiring. I certainly loved working with some of these folks on it and getting to know them and some of their work. So let me just see if I can get back to where I was. But So the key there is distinctly religious perspectives like the Christian. So let me, you know what I got to do? There we go. I'm having a little hard time here. I think I'm just going to do that. There we go. So, while we acknowledge that there's a certain kind of genius in late modernism in excluding distinctly Christian perspectives in the name of rationality and good science, there is also an Achilles heel that it has that we need to do our best to expose. And that is that it's based on a secular worldview, and just like all religions and life philosophies, it holds assumptions about reality that cannot be proven to be true who do not already hold them. It's a function of finitude, that we all have to hold assumptions that we cannot prove to somebody that don't already hold them. And logic talks about circular reasoning be a problem, but the biggest problem is that all finite reasoning is necessarily committed to some form of circular reasoning. It's just not possible to get around it. And modern philosophy, I would say late modern philosophy, has acknowledged that. People like Richard Rorty, I can't remember the big guy, but Quine has acknowledged this. And of course some Christians have been pointing this out. So this is hugely important, and it seems like no secular scholars are aware of this outside of philosophy. And so some of us need to help write articles and point this out to them. I'm so thankful at this stage of my career. I have begun, most of my career I've spent in the church, working with the church, writing to Christians. But in the last few years, I've kind of begun going to my guild in the field of American Psychological Association, and I've started doing presentations that are somewhat either radical or aggressive, somewhere around there. And if it's too aggressive, you know what they're going to say. Sorry, you can't present at our conference, or we're not going to publish this article. And I've I've had plenty of that happen to me. So we have to be subtle and write something in just the right way so that it'll get accepted, but it's radical enough to make a claim that there's, that advances the kingdom of God in some respect. So this particular year, let me just share what I'm doing. I'm so thankful. So I got some other people who are more well known in the division called Psychology of Religion, who are Christians, and we're doing a seminar on worldview and psychotherapy. And there's about 6 of us that are going to be doing this. And to my knowledge, there's never been such a seminar in the APA. Maybe there has been, but not too many of them. And so we're going to make the case that currently in American psychotherapy, only one worldview is allowed, naturalism, with different forms of that. And we're going to advocate for theism and various kinds of theism. And so it got accepted. And I'm so thankful. I'm also doing a presentation on the image of God as a personality construct. I was really surprised that it got accepted, but it got accepted, and so I'm going to get to present on this. So, it's not radical. I'm not talking about the cross. God forbid, right now, that I would talk about the cross. No way would that get published or presented. But little by little, we do what we can. And as part of the challenge is thinking about what's my calling. I decided my calling was to work for the church. But what that means is I have no credibility in my guild, secular guild. Other Christians decided to go a different route, and they worked in the guild. Now they have a lot of credibility. My experience with them is they don't think like I do, and so they don't challenge as much as I would. But it's a decision that we have to make as scholars, particularly younger scholars, to figure out how aggressive or non-aggressive should I be to position myself in the field. Because if I'm too aggressive, I will never get published, or I'll be marginalized in the guild. And so these are complicated decisions, and it's a calling. I'm very happy with my calling, but I'm also happy that at this stage of my career, in my 60s now, I'm going to start working more to push the envelope and to expose. My point here is that I'm trying to expose this Achilles heel nowadays. So, fundamentally, secularism, late modernism, operates just like a religious system, but its proponents don't realize it. Now, I should also say, one of the things that I'm doing in my discipline, in the American Psychological Associations, there's a Division 24 that's dedicated to philosophical and theoretical psychology. And those folks, they hear what I say and they say, yeah, you got a point. Because they're very thoughtful people. So I find that that's a group that's more open to me challenging worldview assumptions, because they do the same in their own way as secularists. They also challenge worldview assumptions. So we have to find our way into the field if we're going to make a difference. And some disciplines are easier than others to do that. So for Christians, modernism as a whole has been a mixed blessing. On the one hand, disciplinary specialization has produced an enormous amount of knowledge in our day that we are all thankful for. All Christians should be so thankful, I think, for disciplinary specialization and increasing specialization to focus on smaller and smaller parts of God's creation. This is a good thing, all things being equal, because human knowledge is becoming more like Christ, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So as a human race, we are imaging God's omniscience better, never fully, of course, but better than we did in the ancient period or the Middle Ages. This is a good thing. But on the other hand, without a supernatural order to provide the ultimate explanatory context of life on earth, disciplinary specialization has produced fragmented, disconnected bodies of knowledge without a center. And this is the death of Christian scholarship. This is the death of theistic scholarship. And I think even some secularists are acknowledging that without some kind of center, we can't relate everything to everything else, and yet it needs to be done somehow or other. It's much harder for naturalism to pull that off, though I think they can do it. The best of them try. But from a Christian standpoint, it's a no-brainer. Of course, everything's related to everything else. The problem is that many Christian scholars in their disciplines don't really realize this. They don't really realize it, and that's causing a problem as well. So, what's happened in the 20th century? What happened in the 20th century is that naturalism and secularism became increasingly confounded with good scholarship and with all disciplinary knowledge. So, what does this mean for the church, for the Christian university? Well, we've all grown up in a secular public world. Television, movies, childhood education are all largely secular. To get advanced degrees, we've all, not all of us, but people outside of the biblical and theological areas, scholars in all the other disciplines, have had to learn their disciplines in an intellectual environment where their worldview assumptions were excluded and weren't permitted in. And when their loving mentors would discourage any reference to those assumptions. They were even policed. You know, that's really what happens with our secular academic mentors. They forbid reference to other worldviews in the disciplines and in class discussions and so on. And following Foucault, who you might be surprised, but I really like Foucault because he's a postmodern critic of modernism. And Foucault talks a lot about the rules of discourse that have developed in modernity. And boy, do I feel them in my field of psychology. The rules of discourse are taught explicitly and implicitly in classes, in journal articles, and in the process of getting journal articles rejected. Can I share an early experience that I had when I was at Michigan State? I did a research study on a phenomenological study of fear of the dark. And I think it was a responsible study. I worked with a Christian faculty member on it, and I submitted it to the Journal of Phenomenological Psychology. But at the end of the discussion, I did this phenomenological research study, and then at the end, I tacked on a Christian interpretation of fear of the dark, pointing to our alienation from our Creator. And the reviews came back. The editor rejected the article and said it was a really good article up until the conclusion. Well, I thought about it. I prayed about it. I wasn't sure what to do. They recommended I delete the concluding section. I decided to do that with fear and trembling. Lord, is this okay? I don't want to deny you. Is it okay? I decided he thought it was okay. So I resubmitted it with their recommendations followed, and they accepted it. It's now published in the Journal of Phenomenological Psychology. So I learned early on the rules of late modern scholarship. And you know what I decided? I guess I'm not going to be participating in mainstream scholarship. So for the next 20 years, I've devoted myself to working in the church. I get published in university press and journals like the Journal of Psychology and Theology, Journal of Psychology and Christianity, which publish my stuff because they're believers. And I'm happy with that. That's my calling. I have no problems with that. But here's the problem of our day. As a result, the Christian intellectual community has largely accepted the secular discourse rules for the various disciplines, with the partial exception of theology, although that's debated, it depends on where you go and study and so forth, and Christian philosophy. And there's a minority, but a very important group of Christian philosophers that are challenging the rules of positivist philosophy in mid-century, led by, who are some of the greats in our day? Alvin Plantinga is the hero, everybody's hero. Swinburne, William Lane Craig, Stephen Evans is a hero. Robert Roberts is not as well known, but he's a hero of mine in philosophy and philosophical psychology, philosophy of ethics, and Nicholas Wolterstorff. Those are all great evangelicals. There's a few Catholics that have also been doing some outstanding work, though not quite as radical as maybe we might wish, but Alistair McIntyre, a real blessing to me in some of his work and helping me to think about conversations between intellectual communities. And then one of my favorites, though he's a little further to the left, is Charles Taylor, and of course the Secular Age, and his analysis of secularism is outstanding. So we're living in a renaissance of Christian philosophy that is deeply encouraging to me in the field of psychology. And if Francis Schaeffer is right that revolutions begin in philosophy and then go into the other disciplines, then maybe the 21st century is going to be a revolutionary century for Christian scholarship. That's certainly what we're praying about with the transdisciplinary group, that the time is right for us to begin challenging the status quo. And I'm seeing it in my discipline of psychology. And another book, based on some work that I did a couple years ago at APA, some Christian friends of mine and a Mormon and a Confucian. We collaborated on a somewhat broader topic of worldview and psychology, and it's being published by Routledge. A set of essays published by a mainstream press. We were surprised, but happy about that. So some of the walls of late modernity are beginning to break down. Now, to be honest, that worldview book is not. It's not arguing for anything more than we need to be fair and allow other worldviews like theism in, but a step at a time. All right. Well, let's talk about the influence of late modernism on Christian scholarship. As a result of what I was just saying, the fact that all Christian scholars, in order to get a master's degree or a doctorate in a particular discipline, you have to be socialized into the rules of late modern discourse. Much well-meaning Christian scholarship in the late modern era has been compromised implicitly by assumptions alien to Christianity. For example, most Christian scholars today adhere solely to late modern rules of discourse in their disciplinary work, and they avoid explicit discourse, Christian discourse, like reference to the image of God, sin, redemption. They just don't talk about it. Now, I understand why they typically don't talk about it in the organs of their discipline, but what's really troubling, I think I want to say, what's really troubling is that when you ask them about what are the true rules of discourse in your discipline, they would look at me puzzled and say, what do you mean? It's the way things are done. And so Christian scholars simply accept late modern rules of discourse and teaching. And they don't go any deeper than that. So in one of our transdisciplinary consultations, we invited a famous Christian historian who you probably know, most of you would know. And I was using as an example in writing the history of the Great Awakening in America, which had happened around Jonathan Edwards' time, and Jonathan Edwards wrote about the Great Awakening. I said, in Christian scholarship about the Great Awakening, we need to talk about the Holy Spirit as a causal influence in the Great Awakening. And he raised his hand and he said, no, I'm sorry, but you just jumped into theology there. That's not history. And this fellow has written many books on Christian scholarship and on Christian history, and he's done good Christian history and American scholarship in history and so forth. American religious history. But that's just a powerful illustration of the challenge. If the best Christian scholars of our day do not believe that you can use theological language in the discipline, we're not going to get to first base on this project if there's any value to it. This allows them, and I want to say us, because I do the same thing. I'm not against writing using those rules. I think you have to in order to get published. I think we need to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as a dove, and we need to do whatever we're called to do in order to advance the kingdom of God, understood from various vantage points. So I'm not opposed to this. I do this. I've written articles where I don't cite any Bible verses, or at least very few, when I think about one article in particular. Because I want to get published. I need to get published because I want to advance the field in a particular way. This allows us to contribute to the modern form of the discipline, but only so long as we play by those rules. And then, here's the biggest problem. The secular version of the disciplines gets taught to students at Christian colleges and universities. And it's often called integration. So, some of us have used the word integration in a friendly way. Let me be clear. I love integration. I do integration. I've written articles supporting integration. I'm not against it. But I am very much against the way it's practiced in America most of the time. I would say 95% of the time. People use the word integration. What they mean is, and this is going to sound unfair, what they mean is separation. It's a mystery. It's like, what? Integration means separation? Why is that the case? Trained at secular institutions, many Christian scholars have assumed that the modern version of their discipline is basically correct. What is often lacking is a familiarity with the intellectual resources of the faith, worldview awareness, and a Christian scholarly imagination. So what ends up happening in integration programs, and I've seen this in psychology, and I'm assuming I've seen it in many disciplines, but firsthand in the disciplines of psychology. What happens is we accept the secular version of psychology as the way it is supposed to be done. And then we integrate faith, moral principles, a few Bible verses, or we pray at the beginning of class, but nothing substantively gets changed in that. And so I call it separation because the model of integration assumes a fundamental division between each discipline and the Christian faith. It assumes a division at the deepest of levels. And for that reason, that's why we don't call our project integration anymore. Even though we do integration, of course. You see what I'm saying? I believe it, but when I use that word, 95% of my audience isn't going to understand what I'm trying to argue for is something more radical. Now you see why I use the word radical. Or transdisciplinary is like, what do you mean by that? And so then I have to explain what I mean by that. So, given such assumptions, integration is seen as an optional task. It's something you do. It's so, I joke about it. It's inferior to the real work of the discipline. And what happens at some Christian schools is the capstone integration course that's supposed to be done in the senior year is used to justify why deep and thorough integration didn't actually occur throughout the rest of the program. I hate to say it so strongly, but I'm afraid that this is largely true. So I don't think I'm going to go into any detail about psychology. This is my area of expertise. Usually when I give this talk, I explain how everything that I talked about is illustrated in the field of psychology, which for decades has used the word integration positively, and some good work has been done. But it also psychology in America now, I think, illustrates the very problems quite well that I've already talked about. So the rest of our time together, I'm going to argue for an alternative approach to integration. I'm going to use I'm going to try and develop a different way of thinking about this, suggested by two saints. There are fundamental, according to, this is St. Augustine, a picture of St. Augustine. Nobody knows what he looked like, but that's as good a guess as any. There are fundamentally two cities or two communities in the world. And the Christian scholar's community of identity is to be the city of God. And as you know, if you're familiar with his city of God, the city of God is well, maybe we could start with the city of man, or the city of humanity is a city that loves self and despises God, is one of the ways that Augustine puts it. And of course, we're all born into that city. And the city of God is those who have been rescued from that city and love God supremely, and are learning how to despise self, I would add, in the right way, because that's a pretty strong statement for a counselor to state. But there's a right way to lose ourselves in Christ. And so Augustine is really a person who charted a different path in integration. And so pretty much everybody that in the Christian tradition that is sympathetic to this agenda is familiar with Augustine's understanding. Another saint that I want to point us to is Saint Abraham Kuyper. Protestants can have saints. And in his book, Principles of Sacred Theology, he argues, somewhat indirectly, that the two cities model of thinking about culture and society leads to two sciences. That is, there will be two fundamentally different versions of each of the human sciences, or each of the human disciplines, if I can put it a little bit broader, with the Christian version being based on divine regeneration of the human heart. Now, he uses that German word Geisteswissenschaften that some of us might be aware of, that in America we call it the social sciences. I actually prefer the word human sciences, Geisteswissenschaften. It gets translated in English spiritual sciences, but I don't think that's really what the point is. However, he obviously, he was a theologian, a politician. He didn't develop this very far. It's just like seed thoughts of this idea of these two ways of approaching the human sciences. And I think I haven't seen much work being done in this. There's a few folks in America that have been impacted by him. Vern Poythress is one that I'm sure some of us are familiar with. He's written a book on sociology that is deeply informed by this approach, for example. But the problem with a guy like Vern Poythress is he's more theological and he's just very original in his thinking, so he doesn't engage as much with contemporary thought as he might. But we all are doing the best we can. So what I'm wanting to argue for is I'm a follower of Abraham Kuyper. When people say, Eric, tell me what kind of a psychologist you are most truly, I say I'm a Kuyperian psychologist because I'm trying to work out a psychology that's based in his understanding of the human sciences. So Alvin Plantinga was also Kuyperian philosopher, and he's written a wonderful essay on Christian, what's advice to Christian philosophers, that basically is making this same claim for Christian philosophy. And he spoke at one of our Christian psychology conferences, Alvin Plantinga, early on, very encouraged by the little work that we were trying to do in Christian psychology. And he wrote a book called Where the Conflict Really Lies. It's a very nice summary of current challenges in the natural sciences in particular. But so I'm just modifying that a little bit. Where our challenge today really lies. If Augustine and Kuyper are correct, the challenge of Christian scholarship is not simply the integration of Christian beliefs and the findings of one's discipline, The real challenge is communal. This goes back to your point about community. It's communal. It's we need to think in terms of what community am I mostly a part of. I'm a member of the Christian community more importantly than the psychology community in America today. That's what has to form my communal identity. And out of that communal identity with its worldview assumptions and the Bible as the primary text of life, then it's an interpretive challenge, it's hermeneutical. It's how do I make sense of the world? How do I read the Christian text in a way that's informative to me as a psychologist? How do I read secular texts in a way so that I'm faithful to my Christian identity and a Christian interpretive grid? And I also want to add a lesson from Jamie Smith, who's been writing on liturgy and the role of embodiment. And I'm not sure where to take that as far as I would like, but somehow we need to live this out in our activities in a way that expresses our deep Christian commitments. Probably the most basic way that happens at a Christian college is in chapel. And I remember a great book on the history of the Christian college by Ringenberg, where he says the one distinguishing feature of evangelical Christian colleges that have maintained their faith over time is required chapel. And you think about that doesn't that sound kind of legalistic, but it's not. It maybe it is legalistic in some ways, but it's also symbolic. It indicates how important Jesus and worship of God is to the life of our school. So it can be done poorly. God knows, I've been in enough chapels in my life. I've seen it done terribly, but there's something of value in that for a Christian institution. But obviously there's so much more. And one of the things that would be really interesting to write a paper on is the liturgy of radical Christian scholarship. It just so happens that I've asked somebody to write that chapter for our book. Peter Lightheart loves liturgy, and he's promised me a chapter on this at some point. Anyway, let me unpack this a little bit quickly. Communal because allegiance to the city of God and its values has to take precedence over those of one's guild. Interpretive because each worldview community will inevitably interpret the world somewhat differently. And liturgical because every worldview community is living out its worship practices one way or another. Okay, this is a complicated point to make and controversial, but I think it has to be made for many reasons. The degree to which Christian scholarship will be distinctive will depend on the discipline. So, it's not going to mean so much in mathematics, in my opinion, in logic. And the natural sciences, a little bit more, biology, origins, somewhat more. Now, I sometimes get, depending on who I'm talking to, I get criticized for various aspects of this. Some people who are strong Kuyperians would look at this and say, Eric, you're conceding too much to secularism here because Jesus revolutionizes everything, even mathematics. And I want to say, yeah, I know that, but it doesn't change algebra. Can't we also say that algebra for a non-Christian and a Christian is algebra? Now, we can worship God in our algebra. It's not. I don't worship God very much in algebra, but I'm just saying, in principle, some people can probably worship God out of the beauty of mathematical formulations. From what I hear, I don't have those eyes to see that beauty, but I hear that it's a beautiful discipline. So it can promote worship, yes, but the content of the discipline is not going to be radically different, except in the deepest areas of the discipline. For example, the philosophy of mathematics. There, it will bear difference. All right, well, let's talk about the emergence of radical Christian scholarship. What do you know? Alvin Plantinga, our hero, another saint, Saint Alvin. Over the past 20 years, a small but growing consensus has emerged regarding a radical Christian alternative. These are folks that I'm identifying who are doing more or less work in this area. Alvin Plantinga, Alistair McIntyre, James K. Smith, Oliver O'Donovan, Paul Moser. Paul Moser is a philosopher that's really radical. He's kind of an open theist, so I can't trust him in every way, but wow, he's done some really good work in this area in philosophy. John Milbank, John Frame, Stanley Hauerwas, Gavin DaCosta, and lo and behold, Pope John Paul II, though he's not as radical as probably everybody else on the list at the end of the day. His distinction between reason and faith is still too separate for me to be. But I want to acknowledge, he wrote an essay on fides et ratio, that at least is in the ballpark. So I just want to acknowledge that at least it's somewhat close. And now, my Catholic friends, I want to say, hey, there's something there. What are the features of this minority consensus? Christian scholarly discourse has some rules and assumptions that are not affirmed by scholars from other worldview communities. For example, the reality of a personal God, appeal to the Bible and theology, the need for the cross and the resurrection, and the value of philosophy and history for all the disciplines. These would be some of the assumptions that I think are going to make a revolutionary distinction in contemporary Christian scholarship. Also, the grounding of one's disciplinary activity on a biblical and Christian understanding of reality. And that Christian disciplinary knowledge should be a synthesis of many things that often aren't included in scholarly discourse. Worship, for example. Knowledge is, of course, in all scholarly discipline, but how about love? We have to figure out ways in which love is a part of what we're doing and talking about and practicing, as well as ethics and ethico-spiritual practices, so that even spiritual formation is, for a Christian, a part of what we do in our discipline. Here's part of the problem of having chapel and thinking that chapel does the work of spirituality, so I don't have to talk about it in any other classes. No, that's not good enough. We need to think about how spiritual formation is a part of everything, so that mathematics becomes worship for this math student. That's how we have to think. And this is beginning to be happening. So that distinctly Christian disciplinary knowledge will be a community product, necessarily synthesizing the activity of different kinds of scholars. And when I say different kinds of scholars, I mean scholars from different disciplines. And that's probably the single most important part of transdisciplinary scholarship. So what are the pillars of radical Christian scholarship? It minimally assumes classic Christian orthodoxy. And so I welcome Catholics who take their faith seriously, Eastern Orthodox folks who take their faith seriously, even though they're going to articulate it differently than I do. I welcome charismatic, Pentecostal, Anglican, Reformed scholars to do this work, who all basically agree on what Lewis called mere Christianity. As God's Word, the Bible and biblical studies has a preeminent role to play in the development of a Christian version of the disciplines. This is, as you know, I'm sure everybody in this room knows this is scandalous to say this. It just doesn't make sense to most Christian scholars, but it has to be said, and we have to say it in the right way. Now, I can't remember if I touch on this in the later in. So let me just touch on this very briefly. What I get pushback from folks who go back to the founding of the natural sciences and astronomy, and they say, "Listen, Eric, when you bring the Bible in, you're inviting fundamentalism in. Remember what happened when Copernicus developed a heliocentric view of the system, that we're a part of, the planetary system we're a part of. And it was resisted by Calvin and others because it wasn't biblical. And you're opening up a can of worms by bringing the Bible into your discipline, into all the disciplines. And I'll say, you're right, I know that, but we can't avoid it. And then they bring up, well, what about the age of the earth? And that's the big conundrum in our day. Because, there are still a few Christians in America who belong to the Flat Earth Society. Believe it or not, you can go, there's a website, Flat Earth Society, you can look it up. And they're biblical, but they're fundamentalists. And so we have to all be really clear. We reject fundamentalism, a kind of wooden, literalistic reading of the Bible. And personally, I'm an old earth creationist. It looks to me, I'm no expert in paleontology and geology. God knows I'm not an expert. But I've read enough of these areas for me to be persuaded that the earth and the universe are millions or billions of years old. And I'm going to leave it to other people to work that out. But I want you to know that's where I'm at. Now, if God created the world in 6 days, and it happened 10,000 years ago, if he did that, I'm going to be the first person in heaven to say amen. I'm not against it. I'm just trying to do the best I can with the information I'm aware of and the Christians that have weighed in on this subject matter. One of the things we have to do in this area is we have to bring the people together in biology, geology, and paleontology to start talking to each other and stop throwing rocks at each other. And some of them are trying to do that. And come up with a better consensus than we currently have. But right now, on the issue of the origins of the universe, we're in the same place that astronomy was in the 15 and 1600s, where it hadn't been settled yet. And it really didn't get settled, from what I understand, until the 1700s, after Newton. And I don't know the story, but by the 1700s, all Christians acknowledged that the sun was the center of our planetary system. But before then, people fought it because of the Bible. So anyway, that's a huge area. We just have to acknowledge it's an issue. But at the same time, I'm not going to back off. Somehow the Bible needs to play the right kind of role. And part of the hermeneutics then is figuring out what was God communicating in the first 11 chapters of the Bible. A lot of people have recognized that there are some hermeneutical principles that might lead us to think that it's a kind of symbolic genre that is unique to that kind of genre, just like apocalyptic literature is unique kind of literature. Anyway, I shouldn't go into it so much detail, but those are some of the things that I've been thinking about while I allow other people to work on this. All right, so however, we must wait. Oh, I think I already said that. We have to interpret it in a valid way. Okay. All right, pillars of radical Christian scholarship. No, I went into this in some detail. I'm going to skip that because I just gave you, the heliocentric whatever discussion. Nevertheless, the Bible reveals to us many basic worldview truths necessary for all the disciplines, as well as many truths about human beings and the created order that bear directly on the human sciences and the humanities. In addition, theological studies and classics from the Christian tradition are legitimate sources of knowledge for all the disciplines insofar as they bear on a particular discipline. So it's not just the Bible. One of the terms that we've thought about, Kevin Van Hooser is pressing me to use, this goes back to Imoga's point about what's the right word. And Kevin Van Hooser has challenged me to use the word retrieval. How would you use that? Christian retrieval? Something like that. So we need to retrieve the Bible and the classics from the Christian tradition in order to do good contemporary work. Another word that's been suggested is reinvesting or reinvestment, that we have to reinvest in these sources that are most likely to inspire deeply and distinctly Christian disciplinary discourse. And of course, there's no better book than the Bible for that. Stanley Hauerwas wrote a book, something like Unleashing the Bible or something. I can't remember the exact title, but he's a good one for that. Okay, well, another pillar of radical Christian scholarship is Christian philosophy. This sometimes gets debated. But I'm convinced that Christian philosophers are going to help to lead all of us into a greater clarity of what it means to be a Christian scholar in our discipline, particularly insofar as they help clarify the nature of the object of the discipline, the concepts, the discourse, and the activity. And, it's easy for me to say that because in psychology there's been a lot of work in philosophical psychology and ethics and ontology, but I just want to encourage you to avail yourself of Christian philosophers who have worked in an area close to your discipline. When Steve Evans came to our first consultation, he pointed out, he said, history is so important to understanding our discipline that I would recommend making history a meta-discipline. We call them meta-disciplines, by the way. I think I'm going to mention that in a minute. Because the history of Christian thought is so important, the history of modern thought and what happened from 1500 to the 21st century, and the history of one's discipline. That's so important in my area of psychology, because it started in the late 1800s, modern psychology. And I get to point out to my students that Soren Kierkegaard wrote about Christian psychology before Freud was even born. It's so much fun. It's like, wow, So history, I do think, is a kind of meta-discipline. The problem is, the more that I thought about this, because everything is related to everything else, you could keep adding disciplines to what do you need to do a good job. And it's almost like we need everything to see how everything's related to everything else. So there's a law of diminishing returns as to how much we borrow. But I could say that sociology, there's a whole area of science, of philosophy and disciplinary discourse called the sociology of knowledge. So sociology is also helpful. Economics is also helpful. You see the problem. So at the end of the day, I add one more. I do think this is really important. Biblical and Christian spirituality is involved in all the disciplines in that they all tend towards the worship and love of God, the love of neighbor, and the care of creation. But this is my short list, my list of meta-disciplines. And I think I call them that. So some disciplines will be considered meta-disciplines in Christian scholarship. Biblical studies and theology, Christian philosophy, Christian history, and spiritual formation. And I'm just going to limit it at that, even though you could make a case that all the disciplines are needed in all the disciplines. And when you think about how to change Christian scholarship, it gets really complicated. Because one of the things, I don't think I'll mention this, one of the things we proposed is every department at a Christian college should hire a theologian and a philosopher. And I think that's great, and it would give jobs to a lot of young graduates. I love that idea, but most administrators look at me and they say, "You're crazy. We can't afford what we're doing now. How are we going to hire more faculty to teach one class?" So one possible solution is that every Christian philosopher needs to decide on a disciplinary specialization that they can become proficient in. And in their doctoral work, they can do a minor in psychology, sociology, economics, history. And then, in addition to their philosophy curriculum, they could teach one course in the philosophy of economics from a Christian standpoint and help the students and help the faculty. This is where Christian administrators are so important, because Christian administrators can force people to go to meetings. They can't make them enjoy them, but they can force them to go to meetings and to dialogue. And if you develop a loving, brotherly, and sisterly environment, maybe people can continue to grow in their scholarly understanding after they get their PhD. That's a miracle when that happens, but it's at least in principle, the Holy Spirit can do it. All right, I don't want to talk our whole time, but I'm doing a lot of that. But let me see. I just have a few more slides, and then I'm going to open it up to some discussion, and then I give you a little bit of a homework assignment, and then we'll finish up with some more discussion, okay? So, radical Christian scholarship is also called transdisciplinary scholarship, because it assumes that each discipline will require the collaboration of different specialists. And it will be a synthesis of one, the disciplined study of some object by disciplinary specialists, psychologists, economists, historians, and relevant biblical and theological work, and relevant philosophical and historical work, and Christian spirituality. Transdisciplinary. So now you know why we call this model also transdisciplinary Christian scholarship. This is how it differs from integration. Because when I talk to integrationists about this, they say, oh, no. Well, what you're talking about is not psychology. And I would say, yes, it's not modern psychology. But what I'm talking about is Christian psychology. So, what this means then is scholars within each discipline will need to be conversant with the meta-disciplines. That means we all have to do a little bit, if disciplinary scholars have to do a little bit of reading in philosophy and theology, maybe more than a little bit, and meta-disciplinary scholars, philosophers, theologians, will need to help out in various disciplines. That means they're going to have to learn the vocabulary and conceptual frameworks of at least one discipline that they can help in. Otherwise, they won't be able to help much. So this is going to require additional work, additional scholarly work. My hero in this area is a fellow named Warren Kinghorn. Now, probably none of you have ever heard of him. He's a psychiatrist. But he graduated from Harvard with an MD in psychiatry, no small feat. And then he went to work in Duke Medical Center and decided, I'm going to get a doctorate in theology at Duke Divinity School under Stanley Hauerwas. And you know what he did his doctoral dissertation on? It was at a rereading of the DSM according to Thomas Aquinas. Amazing, amazing. So he's my hero. I think Warren Kinghorn. Kinghorn. Just the English words, Kinghorn. Unfortunately, he's not written any books yet, and his dissertation is not published. I begged him to publish it, but you can imagine he's a psychiatrist who teaches in the Divinity School.
I would love to read that.
Yes, it was a great. You know, he's willing to send you a copy, an e-version of it. He'll send you a PDF of it. So if we can figure out how to do that, I would love to send it to you or have him send it to you and you get to know him. But he's my hero. I think all of us need to get 2 doctorates.
Are you serious?
Well, I'm not going to do it, but I think you should.
I like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I just don't know too many people that have the energy and the ability. I mean, he's a genius. Warren Kinghorn is like the smartest person I know. So there's a few of us that can pull that off, but most of us just do the best we can. And it's a matter of calling and children and, all the rest. One other point that I want to make before we finish is I want to make, somebody used the word ghetto today. Maybe it was you, Richard, or Robert. I'm sorry, Robert. I get accused of a lot with this project. Eric, you're just going to reinforce a Christian fundamentalist ghetto where Christians are writing to themselves and that's all that happens. And this might sound a little strange, but my first response is, and what's wrong with that? That's my first response. Is that all bad? I wish I had more of a ghetto environment. And yeah, there's a hearty cultural life in the inner city in America in some good positive respects, though I know there's a lot of bad things in the ghettos.
Isn't sheep among the walls of a ghetto?
Yeah, there we go. We need to protect our sheep, and we need to help our sheep think like Christian sheep. Okay, and if that amounts to a kind of ghetto, I sometimes think before we engage modern secular culture, we need to form our ghetto for a while and work together and collaborate and develop Christian schemes of things, and then we can do the work. One of the problems with integration is we tried to do integration too quickly, and we got swallowed up by modernity, and we didn't realize it. And it's not working, so we got to rethink the project. But my second, after I calm down and I stop being defensive, I say, of course you're right. I don't believe that Christianity is only for the church. I believe Jesus is the Lord of the universe, and he claims every person to be his follower. So I want to say that the Christian community actually has a calling to two cities. Our first calling is to the city of God, and then our second calling is missional. And we need to work within the guilds, the professional guilds, the public square. We need to be writing in winsome and thoughtful and creative ways that are compelling and in modern magazines, journals, newspapers, on the web, and so on. But that's not easy to do. So, let me break this down into a two-pronged strategy. Radical Christian scholarship is based in the city of God. Our headquarters are there. And let us never forget that. Secondly, its vitality requires learning from, participating in, and contributing to the broader academic community. This is one of the lessons of Alistair McIntyre's important work, because he says a living community is engaged with contemporary other communities, and what we find is other communities are contributing things that we didn't think of first, and so we learn from them, and that's clearly the case in psychology. Christian scholars, I guess we've already talked about this, I'm repeating myself, need a Christian hermeneutic to interpret and translate properly the texts of other worldview communities. It's an important work that needs to be done. And the city of God can best promote change in the public square by becoming true to its true creation radicality, its resurrection potential. And secondly, by advocating a genuine pluralism and dialogue, looking for opportunities to speak and live from a distinctly Christian orientation, and taking risks of being marginalized. But the better we do our work, the more compelling it will be. One of my favorite scholars in this, that's living right on the edges of Christian scholarship right now, is Christian Smith, who's a sociologist at Notre Dame. He used to be at Duke, but now he's at Notre Dame. Became a Catholic about 10 years ago. And I don't agree with everything he's doing, but he's written a book on the sacred something of sociology, the sacred history of sociology. And it's published by a mainstream secular press, but it's a Christian, or at least a theistic critique of American sociology in the 20th century, showing how religiously based secular sociology is. And I've never read a better book on a Christian critique of a discipline. However, he doesn't quote the Bible in that book. He doesn't cite much in Christian. It's not a Christian book, and so he's not. I don't know what he would think of this lecture today. I don't know, but I want to say what he's doing is very compatible with everything I've said today. He's just focusing on addressing contemporary secular sociology, and doing so from a theistic, not a Christian, but from a theistic standpoint. And I applaud what he's doing, and I want to encourage that. And someday we're going to invite him to one of our conferences.
Could you say his name and the name of the book again?
Yes. Let me look it up. His name is Christian Smith. And let me look it up on one of my best friend's Amazon search engine.
What do we do without it?
Yes. He's got a really bad book on the Bible, honestly. But, here it is. It's called The Sacred Project of American Sociology. Really important work. The Sacred Project of American Sociology. I have a dream of a dozen books that I can imagine being written, not by me, but by a community of scholars. One of them would be having a chapter on 10 different human sciences or humanities from his perspective, written for secularists, but from a deeply theistic standpoint. But anyway, he's doing that kind of work. Let me add one more point, is that we have to respect individual calling. Some Christian scholars are called to work more in the city of God. That's been my calling most of my life, and I'm happy to do that. Christian Smith's calling has been to work more in the city of humanity. And that's wonderful. There should be no argument about that between groups. It's all good. Some people can do both, like Warren Kinghorn, but most of us aren't that smart. So we don't have the time and the resources to do that. But it's a calling that we're called to realize. Now, my last radical point is that radical Christian scholarship is apocalyptic. And I just like that word. I'm not sure what I mean there, but I just like it. I like the word. Radical Christian scholarship is part of the breaking into this age of the new creation in scholarship and education. And so it's a resurrection calling. Part of the participation of believers in Christ's resurrection through union with Him and communion with the triune God, as their knowing, loving, imagining, and living is being conformed to Christ's image. So may it be so. May the Lord pour out His Spirit in our day. Wouldn't it be great if by the year 2050, it's too late, 2050, there is a whole body of literature in all the disciplines that's radically Christian. Now, I probably will be dead by then, but maybe a few of the younger, you will still be here, and maybe maybe some of us will still be around, but may the Lord begin that revolution while we're all still alive, so that we can see at least the first fruits of that.